Welcome back to the London Futurist Podcast. Our guest in this episode is Karl Pfleger. Karl is an angel investor in Rejuvenation biotech startups and is also known for creating and maintaining the website Aging Biotech Info. That website describes itself as structured info about aging and longevity and has the declared mission statement, everything important in the field outside of academia, organized. Previously, Karl worked at Google from 2002 to 2013 as a research scientist and data analyst applying AI and machine learning at scale. He has a BSc in computer science from Princeton and a PhD in computer science and AI from Stanford. Karl, welcome to the London Futurist Podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Thanks for joining us, Karl.
Karl, your page on LinkedIn asks people not to pitch you with investment opportunities unless they are in the field of rejuvenation biotech. Why this strict focus?
There's two aspects to this. One is my preference for rejuvenation over approaches to the aging longevity field that simply slow aging. And that preference is simply due to the fact that I want to be able to help all people who are already old. The goal is to restore everybody back to peak prime of life health, which is basically young adulthood, and that requires rejuvenation. The other aspect of this is that just it's amazing how many people pitch you if they know you're an investor on LinkedIn with all kinds of things. Oncology right now is a very big field, and so anybody who hears you're a biotech investor tries to sell you on an oncology startup and all kinds of other things, movies and everything. And I'm just very busy because of the website. It takes a lot of my time above and beyond the investing.
You've been observing rejuvenation biotech since, I think, the mid-2010s. Can you talk about the changes that you've seen in that time?
Yeah, mostly it's growth of the field, which is great. Most things are up and to the right. There's more money, there's more people, there's more companies, there's more clinical trials, there's more discussion, there's more groups forming to support the field and trying to figure out how to do so. So that's all great. In the early 2010s, there was some pretty good science showing that aging was malleable, that you could interfere with it, but there wasn't much of a biotech scene. There was dwindling NIH budgets, and people were looking for ways to get more money in the field. And then the mid-2010s was when it really became a thing that venture money, startup investment money, VCs from the Silicon Valley area were doing a couple percent of their stuff, not just in tech, but in biotech, and specifically in aging longevity biotech. And basically, it's just been up and to the right since, with normal fluctuation. So that's all great. So that's the main thing I've seen. More money, more interest, more people coming into the field, and more established biologists switching some fraction of their focus towards aging and not just the other things that had captured their interest in biology before that, including especially, of course, oncology.
But what about actual therapies, trials that have gone all the way through to things being available for wide use?
The pipeline starts in academia, and then you get to something that's good enough that you think can have legs and get to FDA trials. Then it goes into companies, and then the companies do preclinical work in animals, and then the companies get into human clinical trials, and there's phase 1, 2, 3, and then ideally, hopefully approval, sometimes conditional approval, and a phase 4 kind of thing. That whole process from the academic science being mostly worked out, I mean, you can go back a step into the whole, here's the idea, we'll write the grant, and then there's years of doing the initial academic work. It's 10-ish years to go from the company formation through to the drug trial approval in a lot of cases. There's variations depending on indications and orphan designation and other things that you can do to speed the process. But it takes a while, 10 plus years if you include some of that academic stuff. So we haven't really got the ball rolling. The field is actually at a really exciting part right now because it's been 10-ish years almost since the earliest ones, but less than that for most of the field. And so There are a bunch of companies with phase 3 clinical trials that are really legitimately attacking fundamental aging pathology, and more in phase 2 clinical trials, but nothing's really gotten through yet. Arguably, we have some supplements that probably have real effect, and we have some established drugs that came along before the field really got going, like rapamycin, that probably have real legitimate effects. We don't know exactly how much in humans, but you can't talk about how many clinical trials we've done over the past 10 years and clinical trial approvals increasing because it only really started 10 years ago. So the pipeline has been building and we have a huge amount going. I started the agingbiotech.info website about 5 years ago, so about half of that time. It's a very big difference how many different companies were in different clinical trial stages 5 years ago versus now. So there's a huge progression, but we haven't gotten quite to the approvals yet for the new stuff. Actually, there's a big inflection point coming, and it's a big, interesting question in the field. How much will that capture the public's imagination when the first things really do get approved? And it's a big question which ones those will be, because there's quite a few phase 3 trials and phase 2 trials going on at the moment. Some of them come from companies that don't see themselves as aging longevity companies. They come from some adjacent field, but it turns out that the biology that their therapeutic is going after is really attacking some fundamental aspect of aging. And so that'll be really interesting when those start getting approved.
Is AI starting to reduce that 10-year period that it takes? The initial hope was that it would dramatically telescope that time. Companies like Insilico seem to be finding that it certainly speeds up the identification of molecules to test, that the testing process is hard to telescope, and that's the biggest part.
So I want to answer this AI question. I have something to say on it, but let me just give some numbers to answer the previous question real quick. About 5 years ago, there were something like 8 companies that I knew about that had phase 3 clinical trials and 10 companies in phase 2 clinical trials that I legitimately considered aging longevity companies. And now there's something like 17 to 19 companies in phase 3 that I know about and 28 to 30 in phase 2. So 2x or so as many in phase 3 and roughly 3x as many in phase 2. So that's real progress. Now, some fraction of that is because I've discovered companies were really working on something that I didn't know about 5 years ago. But quite a lot of that is the companies actually having progressed sometime over the last 5 years in their clinical trial stage. Okay, back to your AI question. How much is AI speeding up the clinical trial process? The answer is we don't know yet. There's lots of good reasons to think that it is going to speed up several of the different steps, but we don't have enough data yet because it's going to take time. The trials take so long that we're not going to know for several years just how much it's speeding things up. You hear Alex of Insilico talk about stuff. Of course, he has incentive to sound enthusiastic and optimistic about it. But I do believe it's true that quite a few of the steps are faster. And that's fighting against the fact that there's wet biology that you can't perfectly simulate in silicon. Things like training a Go program or a chess program can be sped up essentially infinitely because the computer can play itself. The rules of the game are easy to simulate digitally perfectly, and therefore the computer can play against itself. Anything where you can have the whole thing be digital will speed up a lot faster. But in biology, we don't have the perfect simulations of the cell or the whole organism level or the organ level. And as a result, you still have to do the wet science and put it in humans eventually and see what happens in those humans. And there's only so much you can speed that process up at the moment. I think it will speed up things. I think there's a limit to how much it will speed them up. And we're not quite sure. I don't think we have enough data yet to show just how much it does. Maybe a lot in some of those early discovery and medicinal chemistry steps and in the things that manipulate proteins. And I think it's also going to get better as we go on as well. It's a moving, hard to estimate target, and I don't know how to quantify the exact answer.
We'll put something in the show notes as a link to the episodes we recorded with Alex Zavaronkov of Insilico. About these phase 3 trials that might change the public's view of the whole field, are you able to pick some of them out? Are they involving senolytics, for example, or are there other types of trial?
I don't actually have a good set of favorites in my head. Most of the phase 3 trials come from these companies that are sort of longevity adjacent, stem cell companies or companies with some kind of neurodegeneration play. But let me see if I can pull up agingbiotech.info. Actually, what's happening right now that's dominating my life at the moment, I am in the process of overhauling the agingbiotech.info list of companies in the field. That is going to be a long process because while the site launched 5 years ago with about 100 companies, there's now something like 400. It's taking a while because a lot of times you need to look pretty carefully at each one before you get a sense of what's happening. But for example, one of the two biggest companies in the field, Calico, which started out of Google several years ago, they have a phase 2/3 clinical trial going right now with their partner, AbbVie. What I plan to do, Lifespan.io maintains this Rejuvenation roadmap, which has a list of clinical trials. So that's a good resource. There's also this agingdb.org list that Morton's group has just come out with, but I don't know how well that sorts. At some point when I'm done this overhaul of the companies, I'm going to put together a pipeline sort of like the Rejuvenation roadmap, but being company-centric as the organization. Stealth Bio has a mitochondrial platform that's in phase 3.
Is that a real company?
Literally a company called Stealth Bio. Yeah, it's kind of weird. It's kind of ironic. A lot of times companies will have multiple trials of different therapeutics for different indications, and not all of their therapeutic programs are aging, and not all of their indications are age-related diseases. But in some cases, some of the mechanisms of action do hit a fundamental aging process. It's just that they're trying to get through clinical trials for a non-age-related condition first. But then if that does get approved, it will have theoretically efficacy against a variety of age-related conditions. And I don't have my database organized that way. The Rejuvenation roadmap is a little bit more. Listeners could look at that. I haven't gone through the 17 plus companies that have a phase 3 clinical trial going to see which ones of those are legitimately hitting aging pathways with their molecule and which subset of those are hitting actual age-related diseases. So I don't have a lot of favorites there. I am investing in an earlier stage, and so most of the companies that I've invested in are mostly preclinical and with a couple in phase 1 or 2 clinical trials.
How do you decide which companies to invest in?
My preference for Rejuvenation in order to be able to help the already old means that I limit my company selection to that goal. And as a result, mostly it's things like damage repair or reprogramming, things that you can intermediately dose that will jump some aspect of molecular state back to a more youthful state. Some of the best known of those areas are the ones that have the most companies, and the ones I invest in the most and are my favorite areas are senolytics, so killing senescent cells, because the data on the pathological negativity of senescent cells is so good. I have 3 companies in that subsector of the space, each with its own very different approach, all of which I really like. Epigenetic reprogramming, I think, has been the hot area in the field for a while. I still think that senolytics are ahead of it on progress to the clinic, and therefore it's still sort of my favorite area that I consider to be the vanguard of the rejuvenation stuff. But the epigenetic reprogramming obviously has become very hot in the field with huge amounts of money coming in and a lot of companies. Yamanaka factors, the idea of partially applying them, partial reprogramming to make cells more youthful without having them forget who they are, has really captured the imagination of the field. So I have 2 or 3 or 4 companies in that subfield, one of which is pushing Yamanaka factors, and the rest of which are looking for novel alternatives to the Yamanaka factors, because many people in the field believe that there are many other molecules that can cause a cell to become more youthful without losing its identity. Yamanaka factors were designed specifically to cause a cell to lose its identity and become an induced pluripotent stem cell again. And so if we look for interventions in a way that's specifically designed to cause cells not to do that, but to become more youthful, we might find more powerful ones that are less finicky in terms of how long you apply them to get that therapeutic window without causing teratomas or other negative effects. There's several companies working on this. I can mention names of companies if you want to go there.
We had Daniel Ives, the CEO of Shift Bioscience, in one of our shows.
Yes, Swift Bio is one of the companies I've invested in that I really like. He was one of the earliest people to explicitly talk about trying to separate the rejuvenation of the cell, making it more youthful, versus the dedifferentiation, losing the cell identity, and optimize one versus the other. Then Jacob Kimmel started talking about it at Calico, and then Jacob left Calico and formed New Limit, which explicitly has a big platform working on this with more money than Daniel has at Shift, but both companies are working in parallel with slightly different approaches on this exact problem. And now there's a couple other companies that have come along. Janine Sengstack came out of UCSF after a 6-year PhD, having done a screening similarly and finding some factors there, and now has a company called Junevity, which I've invested in. There's a bunch of others. So anyway, the epigenetic reprogramming is one of my other favorite areas. And then another one that I really like is stem cell secretions, the whole regenerative medicine field about injecting stem cells and all the therapeutic benefits that you get from that has been around for decades, sort of in parallel with the longevity field, and has had some success, but never has had its sort of breakout success. They sort of touch the longevity field, and there's some companies and people who overlap. And one of the things that's been going on there is that it's become increasingly clear to most people that the stem cells, when you inject them into people, one of the things that happens is they send out signals that help rejuvenate the cells around them, or the other cells maybe far away even, that receive those signals. And so people have been trying to detangle what those signals are. So one of the companies, Juvena Therapeutics, that I've invested in is trying to detangle what some of those signals are, what the protein signals are specifically, and then give those as recombinant proteins that can be mass produced. Other companies in the field, Immunis is one that I've invested in, are trying to just take everything that comes off the stem cells and give the whole secretome as a therapy. And there's some good data there. And there's a second company working on that now. It's a minor opinion and it's untested, but I think that within the secretions of the stem cells are probably Yamanaka alternatives that create epigenetic rejuvenation. So I think in some ways those two sub areas are similar, but they have different origins. That's the sort of template of the kind of company I like to invest in. So atherosclerosis reversal companies that are actually removing the plaques rather than simply reducing the rate at which they build up by lowering cholesterol. Telomere lengthening, because that reverses quickly, a thing that slowly changes over time. I have one company in that, rejuvenation technology. So all of those kinds of things that take some aspect of molecular state and figure out how to reverse it back to the way it was at a more youthful age.
You mentioned Calico, Karl, which is a Google spin-off or subsidiary. It was a Google moonshot. And when they were launched back in the early 2010s, they were very secretive. Are they being less secretive now?
Like Altos Labs, which has now joined them, they're sort of the two Bell Labs-like. Decades ago in computer science, Bell Labs was this amazing juggernaut that came out of a for-profit company and lived under the umbrella of a for-profit company, but was essentially like an Ivy League or Stanford or MIT level research university with huge amounts of amazing new inventions and research coming out of it. And so Calico and Altos are both essentially like giant Ivy League level, Cambridge, Oxford, MIT, Stanford level, world-class biology departments. Calico has, according to its website, I think 17 PIs and Altos 21. I think the model is that they're operating as these giant research departments, almost like they're in academia. That's the model to the PI, but with the PI not having to apply for grants and waste half their time doing that. Instead, they just get the money and they can work on the research. Altos is a little newer, so it's hard to tell, but both of those, certainly Calico, are going to be doing the same thing that biology department professors do. Their labs are going to be publishing papers. That has been happening. And so it's a little less secretive that way. It is still somewhat secretive, but Altos is working specifically in the epigenetic reprogramming area. And as I said, it's got a little ways to go before clinical application. But Calico has got this partnership with AbbVie to actually develop the things that come out of the lab. And that's actually got things in the pipeline. They actually have clinical trials going. Those are, of course, public to the extent to which all clinical trials have registered information on clinicaltrials.gov. So I think they're semi-less private than they were, in the first year or two. To build up sort of a Bell Labs type thing from scratch is a kind of hard process. For the first year or two, you kind of expect secrecy because there's a lot of money and there's a lot of egos of people in the field as you select the PIs and stuff. But I think Calico has sort of got a rhythm now. The people from there do go to local conferences and international conferences. You can find them submitting posters on the things they're working on, and you can talk to the researchers. Cynthia Kenyon from Calico comes to conferences and discusses things, and those people from Altos, they both give talks, they both publish papers, and not just papers, they publish databases and free tools sometimes. Calico has published a really good C. elegans aging database. One of the tables on agingbiotech.info is a databases table that has a bunch of really interesting free databases for the practitioners in the field. They can grab quite a lot of free data that can be analyzed. And so Calico is one of the groups that have put forth some of that data.
And Calico is from Google, and Altos is funded significantly by Jeff Bezos. Do they have much more money than anybody else, or are there others of the same sort of scale?
Those two have raised the most money of any of the companies that I'm aware of. Altos famously was founded with $3 billion, and Calico with $1.5 billion, with $1 billion added later. $2.5 billion, $3 billion. Those are the top fundraisers of the private companies in the space that I know about. There are other companies that have raised hundreds of millions, in some cases have gone public and have market caps in the billions or close to it. But those are definitely the gorillas of the space.
There's also Hevolution, but Hevolution fights shy of saying that it's about rejuvenation, doesn't it?
Well, it's a state-funded, not-for-profit. It's not the same legal entity category as Calico and Altos. It's a Saudi government-funded nonprofit that is both going to do charitable grant making, like the NIH, give grants to researchers, and also do for-profit investing. But the profits will then go back into more investment and granting in the field, supposedly.
Karl, you've given many examples of things going pretty well. Larger numbers, more trials, more discussion. Are the things that give you pause, give you worry about the future of this field?
Most of my worry is external. The biggest bad thing to happen to the field, I think, in the last 5 or even 10 years is the 2022 global downturn in the stock markets, which caused a lot of economic pain to everybody, and especially to startups across the board, across sectors. And that was clearly reflected in what's happened in the field too. Companies in the field after spring to summer 2022 really felt a crunch. A lot of companies that were on the margin failed because they couldn't raise money. Some of those probably deserve to fail. All economic turmoil always gets rid of the sort of worst companies that probably shouldn't have been getting money in the first place. But some good companies clearly failed. And even the good companies that have survived have failed to raise the next larger round for the most part, with exceptions like the Altoses of the world. But a lot of good companies who had just raised Series A, who probably would have raised Series B by now, are now raising simply a second A or a bridge round to just keep them going until the economic turns back to more normal. So I think that's slowed down the field, just like it slowed down everything. There's not a lot of other disasters, I think, in the field. Unity Biotechnology had a phase 2 clinical trial for knee osteoarthritis that failed to reach its clinical endpoints. It was only a big deal because it was the farthest out there in the senolytic field. And so that just delayed how fast senolytics could possibly get to approval for any therapy. But it wasn't one of the best ones. It was sort of a first generation senolytic. I think the stuff that's coming along behind it is better. And Restore Bio had a phase 3 clinical trial fail for some lame reasons, where the FDA caused them to switch their primary endpoint. But I think those are small speed bumps, not major setbacks.
What was the cause of the global downturn in stock markets? And is that likely to be undone anytime soon?
Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. It started with COVID, and that caused all kinds of crazy valuations for the internet stocks. COVID also caused these massive disruptions in global supply chains, and that started raising prices. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine started, and that caused even more global disruption and uncertainty. I'm not the right person to speak about macroeconomics, but those are the obvious culprits to consider. But it's the knock-on effects that matter. Luckily, the good companies, I think, are surviving, and we still have funding for some of the science. I think there's some worry that big downturns in NIH budgets are coming, And we'll see if that happens. And if that does, that could be bad. And of course, there's new proposals to reorganize the NIH. And one of the aspects of that is changing the NIA to specifically focus on dementias and not have anywhere that fundamental biology of aging lives within the new proposed thing. The political lobbying in the US for longevity group, the A4LI, Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, has a counter proposal to create a new Aging and Longevity Institute within the NIH. A bunch of people have signed that petition, but we'll see what happens there.
One argument is that the funding will return when the public see the possibilities and believe in the possibilities, that people are hesitant just now and there isn't enough pressure on politicians. Well, pressures on politicians to lots of other things. Is that an argument you share?
Yeah, this is a super exciting time in the field because, as I said, the field has grown a lot. There's a lot more people in the field, a lot more people know about the field. There's a lot more popular articles about the field. It's gone mainstream in news media. You get articles in Time and New York Times and The Economist. Everybody has covered it a little bit. And at the same time, the lay public still doesn't fully appreciate what's happening in the field. The big question mark in the field is what is going to be the moment where it really becomes clear to the wider world that one can interfere meaningfully in aging, that it is potentially possible to make huge gains by targeting this biology and not just trying to cure cancer and heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's all separately. Nobody really knows what's going to be the thing that causes that inflection. Some people are frustrated and think that's not going to happen for a long time. Some people think it's going to happen within 3 to 5 years. It's anybody's guess. Looking at the clinical trial pipeline and the number of companies involved, and the fact that there's a bunch of things in phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials, I think if any of those actually get through, there's going to be some delay before they can label expand to get approved for other clinical indications, or some delay before physicians start prescribing them off label. But when either one of those things happen, I think that's one potential thing that could really propel a sea change in public awareness, which would then drive knock-on political effects and fundamentally change the field. So what are the other ones? Another one could be some gigantic improvement in dog longevity or companion pet longevity. Maybe that will capture everyone's imagination and maybe that will get approved and get into millions of dogs long before the human clinical trial and off-label prescription or label expansion. Or maybe somebody will come up with a therapy that simply delays everybody's aging, increases the amount of health span by a year or two, and that data will be so incontrovertible that that will cause the sea change. And that could even be an existing drug like rapamycin or a supplement combination. Maybe it'll be because of some aging tests, some next generation aging clock that enough people believe in to really all say is good. Nobody knows. But there's a good chance that the sea change of opinion in the wider public could happen within 5 years. So it's a very exciting time.
Of course, some of the public opinion might not like it. I'm always surprised by how many people I speak to about longevity who go, I don't like the idea. 80 years is long enough, and any more than that is selfish, damaging, and you can make all the obvious arguments against that. But a lot of people are really stuck in that mindset.
So the first order thing, the thing I think that gets most people is that when most people hear about it, what they picture is being like their grandparents or their parents when they were very old.
True, but even when you make it very clear that that's not what you're talking about, they're still resistant.
Right, and it turns out when you make it clear, though, it does help a lot. There are survey data. I was actually part of a paper on this called Great Desire for Something in the Public with Kristen Fortney and Jo Beth Lacroix and a couple other people, where it talked about how if you do these surveys, like the New York Times had done this survey asking people how long they want to live, and everybody had chosen the least long time. But then if you switch the question to specify good health and good mental health, then they all want to pick the long time. So it does really change a lot of people. But yes, there are also these objections on grounds of overpopulation and long-lived dictators, and it's only going to be for the rich. One of the second things I did when I created the agingbiotech.info website, after the list of companies, I was just going to have it be a list of companies for a long time. And then after I heard enough of these things and saw enough of the responses, I decided that I needed to collect them. Enough people had written good responses to each one of these objections that showed how terrible of an objection it was, that I thought somebody needed to collect them all. So I have those a one-page table on the site called Objections, and it just summarizes the 3 best counterarguments to each of the top 10 or so most common objections.
I saw that, and I think it's a really good thumbnail rendition of all the good counter arguments. But like I say, I've been through, with quite a few people I know, I've been through all of those arguments. I've rebutted all of their objections, and they still say, no, 80 years is enough. And this is people who are in their 70s, so they haven't got long to go.
Two more things to say about that. One is that the universal counterargument that works for almost all of the objections is, do you think that we should stop trying to cure cancer for the same reason that you object? And most people don't think we should stop trying to cure cancer. And there's a disconnect there. And you focus in on that disconnect.
Yeah.
And then the other thing to say is that it's amazing how people can be so resistant when they actually think it's unachievable, but that when they really truly are convinced that it actually is available or could actually work or could actually be available to them or their loved ones, they suddenly flip and want it.
That's what I'm banking on.
And there's also the other side of that, the young people who think it sounds terrible, but then when they get old, then they think it sounds great because they want to be young again.
So what are your plans for Aging Biotech Info? It sounds like there's a lot of things that could be improved on it, but it's going to be quite a big task. So are you going to open it up for other people to help you with it?
Yes. It started out as a list of companies, and there were only about 100, but that was something like 5 times as many as most other people thought were in the field. And so that was the reason I open sourced it and made it public. Now that has scaled by 4x or more. But along the way, in the last 5 years, the main thing that's happened is I've really expanded it from just being mostly this list of companies to a one-stop shop for what I said as everything important in the field that's outside of academia, organized and linked. So it's got a list of the best books and the best podcasts, the main top-level conferences in the field, a list of nonprofits in addition to for-profits, so all the major research organizations and advocacy organizations. So that's a great one-stop shop for people who are trying to think about what their charitable giving should be any given year, or who have rich friends and want to nudge them to give more to the field. The list of databases that I mentioned earlier. And there's about 20 tables now. And I have 1 or 2 more that I want to launch in addition to revamping the companies table, which is sort of the big and most important one. The companies table, initially, it was something one person could do. And I wanted to do it by hand personally because I wanted the information to flow in front of my own eyeballs so I would have some sense of it in my own head. Now it's just about scale to the point where I think it's getting impractical to even keep it updated as a single person. For a long time, I've been letting other people help, but that's not been very systematic. So there's a contact page there on the site, has an email address that you can reach out to me, and it has a Google Groups mailing list that you can request membership for. So there's a small army of people who mostly don't do much, but do pay attention and are supporters. Anybody in the field who wants to help, I will give comment level permission, and they can help update it by submitting updates, and I'll just code review them and then make them live for everybody. In the future, after this companies table major overhaul, I'm probably going to have to more formalize, have some kind of group or army of helpers to help keep it up to date. And then I might make UI changes or something else, or I might create a narrower rejuvenation focused version that's easier to keep up to date. I'm not sure.
If it's not a rude question, Karl, do you take any supplements or drugs to extend your own longevity? I'm sure you eat well and sleep well and exercise a lot, but do you take rapamycin or metformin or NAD supplements or anything?
The short answer is I don't take anything that's sort of non-standard and comes from the field and is thought of as a longevity thing. I take the sort of normal supplements. The base level is exactly what you said: healthy lifestyle, diet and exercise, and making sure I get as much good sleep as I can, and not taking any of the bad stuff. So I don't drink alcohol, I don't do recreational drugs, I don't do tobacco products or smoke anything. And then the normal supplements like vitamin D, because I sit indoors too much of the day and don't behave like our evolutionary ancestors. Omega-3 fatty acids, because I eat a vegan diet, and a few other things. I take a much less than bodybuilding dose of creatine, a physiological dose, to replace the creatine I would have gotten from a meat diet because there's some homocysteine related effects. You don't need creatine, but it produces homocysteine as a byproduct if you eat a vegan diet and produce it internally. So things like that. A little extra zinc since COVID.
So why no rapamycin or metformin, etc.?
Well, here's the thing. There's a table on the agingbiotech.info website, agingbiotech.info/therapeutics, which tries to list the 30 or 40 things most commonly talked about as available now therapeutics. That's supplements and over-the-counter drugs and existing prescription drugs that are already approved for something else, like rapamycin, that theoretically have good effects. The problem with all of them at this point is that though we usually, in most of the cases, know a little about what they target and what is up and downstream of that, we know what pathway they hit. But in almost all cases, we don't have good clinical diagnostics or biomarkers to tell each individual human or their doctor where that particular person is in terms of levels of that relevant pathway. So we don't actually know who needs that particular therapeutic. Sometimes there are guesses. For example, metformin. If you're diabetic, then yes, you're probably more likely to need that. Rapamycin hits mTOR. mTOR is also modulatable with diet. So if you eat low protein and low calorie and you're lean, you probably already have low mTOR levels and probably don't need rapamycin. If you're eating a lot, you're obese, you have a lot of high protein intake, then maybe your mTOR levels are higher and maybe rapamycin would help. But for the most part, most of the things that a lot of people take, like rapa and metformin, and GLP-1 drugs for that matter, there's no data showing that they help lean people who have optimized diet and exercise. Even senolytics, there are existing senolytics out there like dasatinib plus quercetin, but we don't actually have a clinical diagnostic to tell you what your level of persistent senescent cell burden is. And so it's hard to know. The best stand-ins we have are just general inflammatory markers, but those are only so-so stand-ins if you go to the senolytic conferences and they talk about how inadequate they are. And actually, in my case, all my inflammatory markers are super, super low end of the scale. So I don't have any good reason to take any of these existing things at the moment. I think that some of the things that are coming that are in the clinical trials are going to benefit me, but I'm going to wait for that data to come out.
And from an unreasonably personal question to an unreasonable question, do you have a best guess for when we'll reach longevity escape velocity?
Yes. This is a great question. The main thing I want to say about this is that the way people talk about LEV is a little too simplistic. The idea of longevity escape velocity is that we'll get some gains that will give us extra time, and in that extra time, new breakthroughs will come along and give us more extra time, and that as long as the breakthroughs start coming along fast enough, we can stay ahead of the curve. The idea of when humanity will achieve LEV as a point in time is kind of flawed. It depends on birth year or on the biological age cohort. LEV will be achieved for young people before it's achieved for old people, because the young people will have that extra time for those extra breakthroughs. And so any discussion of when will LEV be achieved should always be when will it be achieved for people born in year X or for people who have a biological age of 20 at year X. And it's amazing how few discussions of when LEV will happen actually
take that into account.
Include that element, but that's a 100-year difference because some people are going to be 100 years old and some people are just going to be born. And of course, in addition to that 100-year range, there's huge uncertainty. So the answer is, of course, I don't know. I'm somewhat optimistic compared to a lot of people in the field. There are definitely people who think 200 years, there's no way. And there's other people in the field who think we'll achieve it for people who are alive today, maybe even middle-aged today. I think we have a good chance of achieving it for people who are my kids' generation. I think there's hardly any chance for people who are my parents' generation. And I think my generation, the people who are sort of midlife or mid-century right now, are really on the cusp of it. Depends a lot on how fast the breakthroughs come, and it's just anybody's guess. And I think it's not even a guarantee for my kids' generation. But I certainly think it's possible that them or their next generation will get it.
So if you're 50-ish, you've got 50-50 chance.
50-50 is so wishy-washy. Who knows? I think a 50% chance is probably optimistic.
Yeah.
Probably lower, but I wouldn't put it below 10. Of course, chronologically 50, it really depends a lot on how healthy you are.
Yeah.
So all that stuff we talked about in your previous question, diet and exercise, that healthy lifestyle stuff makes about a 10 to 20 year difference in human lifespan. So a 50 or 60-year-old a 60-year-old, say, today could really be a 45-year-old or like a 75-year-old. There's a big difference there.
Final question for me is, if somebody wanted to tilt these probabilities, if they thought, well, these probabilities are a bit low, what can they do to increase the chance? And some of it is maybe campaign to the politicians that more public money should be invested into a more effective National Institute for Aging. Some of it might be wise investment in commercial companies. Some of it could be philanthropic interventions. What would you offer people as wise choices?
This is the key question for so many people right now who want to get into the field. And it's a tough question. Undoubtedly, bringing forward the inflection point, the point at which the public really starts to believe in this and get behind it en masse, and causes the politicians to get in line and the government money to get in line, besides just the Saudi money. Anything that anybody can do to bring that forward is helpful. The small things that everybody can do is simply talk about the field. Talk about it with their friends, with their family members, at dinner. Share things like this podcast and others and books, and just bring it up in conversation. That's a helpful thing that everybody can do, but of course it's only a minor contribution. If somebody really wants to devote more of their wealth or life to really trying to help the field go faster, obviously it's a very idiosyncratic and it depends a lot on what their skill set is. If they have a lot of money, then talking to other people who have a lot of money and investing that money in the companies in the field and doing a lot of charity and philanthropic granting to the nonprofits that are actually pushing the biology and the advocacy are all great things. If they have actual education in biology, then working directly in the field is great, whether in academia or in some of these biotech companies in the field. The problem, of course, is that there's not enough people with those backgrounds. And there's a lot of people with other fields of education who want to help. And that depends on which one. Obviously, if you have background in communications and something like that, you can help disseminate information. A very common one is, for some reason, a lot of people in computer science really like, as I did, because many other people in the field have come, really want to get into the field and help, but their background is software. And there's simply not enough jobs directly doing that in the field. But that's growing. There's more and more bioinformatics. And so you can both look for direct work at a company in the field, or you can do a bunch of education, go back to school, take some side classes on bioinformatics or something like that. Or you can also go work for something in biology or biotech that's not aging and longevity, in the hopes that you can then learn some stuff and move over. So you can go work at a software capacity at a pharma company or at a big biotech company that's not an aging related biotech company. Those are some of the kinds of things you can do. The other thing to do, if you really are in one of these categories where you don't know how to contribute, but you really want to, is try to engage with some of the communities. There's a bunch of young people coming together in various communities. Some of them I've listed on the website. For example, there's the Longevity Biotech Fellowship, which is a relatively small number of people are accepted, but you can apply for that. And that hooks you up with a bunch of people. There's Foresight Institute, which has a bunch of futurism stuff in a bunch of areas, which longevity is one of them. And they run a bunch of events. You can hook up with them. And Longevity Global is a sort of forum for people who are enthusiastic about the field. And so that's a way to socialize with other people. So the more you network in the field, the more likely you are to find ways to help.
We might mention Vitalism as well as another initiative.
Vitalism is another one that's coming along. And of course, you can reach out to me and help by helping to update agingbiotech.info, which requires no special background, just the ability to read web pages.
Many thanks for your time, Karl. You've given us a lot to think about. I encourage everybody to look carefully at the many pages on agingbiotech.info. And if people really are willing to roll up their sleeves and get involved, rather than just being a bystander, then they can join the Google group.
Yes. And also you can follow me on Twitter/X and on LinkedIn, and I post updates to the website there. So when I'm done this big overhaul of the companies table, that will be posted there. And that's a way to keep in touch if you don't want to join the Google group.
Many thanks, Karl. Really interesting.
Thanks for having me on.